Now today we're going to talk about the drainage of venous blood from the brain. This follows on from our discussion of the arterial supply, which can be found in a different video. The venous drainage from the brain occurs via two types of vessels. There's the sinuses and the veins. Sinuses are the spaces between the meningeal dural membranes and the periosteum that lines the inner surface of the bones of the skull. Sinuses are not true blood vessels, and they sit outside of the dura. Veins are true blood vessels, and they can be separated into two subsystems. The superficial cerebral veins run across the surface of the brain and lie under the dura in the subarachnoid space, in close proximity to brain tissue, and they drain the cerebrum. Deep veins, as the name suggests, drain the deep subcortical regions and the white matter surrounding the ventricles. The principal sinus is the superior sagittal sinus, which sits superficially in the falx cerebri. The superficial cerebral veins drain into the superior sagittal sinus via the venous lacunae, which are found alongside, while CSF drains into it via the arachnoid granulations. The superior sagittal sinus follows the longitudinal fissure down the posterior surface of the brain, ending at the confluence of the sinuses. From here, the transverse sinuses emerge. Now we should note at this point that the connections between the right and left transverse sinuses is highly variable. Blood flow from the superior sagittal sinus tends to favour the right side, and in extreme cases, the right transverse sinus is simply a continuation of the superior sagittal sinus. The transverse sinus follows the groove formed by the tentorium cerebelli until it turns downwards around the cerebellum, where it is termed the sigmoid sinus. The superficial cerebral vein follows the course of the lateral fissure, or sulcus, taking tributaries from across the lateral parts of the cerebrum. It passes round the temporal lobe and ultimately drains into the cavernous sinus, which is connected to the sigmoid sinus by the superior petrosal sinus. The cavernous sinus is drained by the inferior petrosal sinus, which ultimately joins the sigmoid sinus, draining into the internal jugular vein. This completes the superficial venous drainage system. But there's also the deep venous system. The deep venous drainage system also comprises sinuses and veins. The inferior sagittal sinus sits at the base of the longitudinal fissure, along on the superior surface of the corpus callosum, running parallel with the superior sagittal sinus above. The internal cerebral veins run atop the third ventricle, joining below the splenium to form the great cerebral vein. This is also known as the great vein of Galen. The great cerebral vein and inferior sagittal sinus join to form the straight sinus, which in turn feeds the left transverse sinus at the confluence of the sinuses. Now, as before, we should note that, as with the right transverse sinus, there is great variability in the degree to which the straight sinus continues directly into the transverse sinus. A small connecting sinus is shown here, but it may be large, may be small. It may be not there at all. The left transverse sinus follows a similar path to the right side, along the groove of the tentorium cerebelli, to become the sigmoid sinus, and thus the left internal jugular vein. Now we should also note for clarity that the cavernous sinus, petrosal sinus, and the superficial veins for the left side of the brain are not shown here, but they follow similar paths to those seen on the right side. Now, much of the medial and inferior surfaces of the cortex drain into the anterior cerebral vein, which closely follows the path of the anterior cerebral artery. It joins with the deep middle cerebral vein, which closely follows the middle cerebral artery, to form the basal vein. The basal veins drain into the internal cerebral veins, and from there to the straight sinus via the great cerebral vein, and therefore onto the jugular.